Why was she sitting alone in that corner booth while everyone else was laughing at the bar? The question hung in the air like smoke, unanswered, ignored. Major Evelyn Reed didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did and simply didn't care. The landing strip was the kind of place where officers went to forget they were officers, at least for a few hours. Stale beer, fried food, the thick cologne of men who measured their importance in volume. But Reed wasn't there for any of that. She sat with her back against worn vinyl, a glass of water untouched beside her, and a technical manual spread open under the flickering neon glow of the bar sign. The pages were dense with equations, algorithms, things that would put most people to sleep before the second paragraph. She was absorbed, quiet, alone, and that apparently was a problem. Three figures detached themselves from the bar. Lieutenant Colonel Vance led the way, chest puffed, uniform just a little too tight across his shoulders. He was the kind of officer who had mastered garrison command but never quite figured out what happened beyond the wire. Behind him came Captain Miller, thick neck, thicker ego, the former college athlete who never quite left the locker room. And then there was First Lieutenant Thorne, young, eager, fluent in the language of sycophantic laughter. They approached her booth like a wave, noise and cologne and unearned confidence. Vance leaned over her table, deliberately invading her space, his voice a theatrical boom designed to draw attention. "Well, well, what do we have here? Reading a book, ma'am. Don't you know this is a place for fun?" Thorne snickered on cue. "Probably a romance novel, sir. All the ladies love those." Reed didn't look up. She placed a finger on the line she was reading, marking her place. Her voice was low, calm, without a trace of irritation. "It's a technical journal, Lieutenant." The words hung there, simple, factual, but Vance smirked at Miller as if she just confirmed something they'd suspected all along. Technical, listen to that. Must be one of those new diversity hires from command, all about the books, no time for the real world. He gestured vaguely at the room, at the other officers drinking and laughing and proving their worth in decibels. This is where the real work gets done. Team building. Miller cracked his knuckles. The sound was deliberate, meant to be heard. "You look a little tense, Major, or is it Captain? Hard to tell with you quiet types." He deliberately misread the gold oak leaf on her collar, a common passive-aggressive tactic. "You should relax, have a drink with us." Reed finally lifted her gaze. Her eyes were cool, steady, gray like winter steel. "I'm fine. Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel. I'm waiting for my transport." Her use of his correct rank, delivered with flat precision, seemed to prick his ego. The smile on his face tightened, grew sharper at the edges. "See, that's the problem. Too formal, too sterile. You're not a robot, are you, Major?" He reached out and tapped the cover of her manual. "What is this garbage anyway? Signal propagation in contested environments. Nobody cares. The war's on a screen now. We press buttons. You're trying too hard." Captain Miller, taking his cue, decided to escalate. He saw her silence not as disciplined restraint but as something else. Fear, weakness. "Come on, have a drink, sir's buying." He grabbed her glass of water and tossed the contents onto the floor. The water splashed across the sticky tiles, dark and glistening under the neon. "Let's get you something with a little more bite." Reed slowly closed her book. The sound was soft but definitive, a period at the end of a sentence no one else had been reading. She marked her page. "That was unnecessary, Captain." Miller's face reddened. "What's unnecessary is you sitting here acting like you're better than us." His voice rose, drawing more eyes, more attention. He was used to women who were either intimidated or impressed. This quiet composure was an insult. "You think because you've got a little rank you can just ignore people. You need to learn some respect." He balled his fist. Vance made a show of putting a hand on his arm, a gesture of performative restraint, the kind that's meant to be shaken off. "Easy, Miller, she's just shy." But Miller shook him off. He was committed now. The audience was watching. His reputation as the tough guy was on the line. "No, she needs to learn." He drew his arm back. A wide, telegraphed haymaker aimed at her head. Some patrons gasped. Some turned away. The punch never landed. In the fraction of a second it took for Miller's fist to travel through the air, Reed moved. It wasn't a flinch. It wasn't a panic dodge. It was something else entirely. Something economical, precise. A sequence of actions so fluid they seemed rehearsed, though they weren't. She pivoted on the ball of her right foot, her body flowing away from the vector of the attack like water around stone. Her left hand came up, not to block, but to guide. Her palm met his wrist, redirecting the momentum of his punch past her ear. Simultaneously, her right hand clamped down on his elbow joint. Miller, overextended and suddenly off balance, was now a victim of his own physics. Reed used his forward momentum against him, stepping into his space. She applied rotational pressure to his elbow, a controlled joint lock, not a break. His arm was forced into an unnatural angle, and a grunt of pain escaped his lips. His forward charge became a stumbling pirouette. Reed completed the motion by placing her foot behind his, sweeping his leg. He crashed to the floor, not with a cinematic bang, but with a heavy, awkward thud. The entire sequence, from the start of his punch to his impact with the sticky floor, had taken less than 3 seconds. It was utterly silent on her part, a physical paragraph written in the language of biomechanics. She hadn't struck him once. She had simply redirected his aggression until it defeated him. Thorne and Vance stood frozen, their smug expressions replaced with slack-jawed disbelief. Reed stood over the groaning Miller, her posture perfectly balanced. She looked down at him, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at Vance. "Transport's here," she said, her voice as level as it had been when discussing her book. She picked up her manual from the table, slid out of the booth, and walked toward the door. She didn't look back. She left behind a stunned silence, a groaning captain on the floor, and 2 officers whose worldview had just been violently destabilized. The red neon light of the bar sign seemed to paint the scene in shame. Back on base, the fluorescent lights of the medical clinic were harsh, sterile white. Major Reed sat on the examination table, the quiet hum of the air conditioning a stark contrast to the bar's noise. The physician, a young Navy lieutenant, carefully documented the rapidly forming bruise on her cheekbone where Miller's knuckles had grazed her during the redirection. "He got a piece of you, ma'am," the doctor said, his voice gentle. "I need to ask for the record how this happened." Reed's tone was factual, as if she were reading a weather report. "I was assaulted by a Captain Miller at an off-base establishment. He threw a punch. I defended myself." The doctor nodded, typing into his terminal. "Did you strike him back?" "Negative. I utilized a joint lock and a sweep. Minimal force was applied to neutralize the threat." The doctor continued typing. "Understood. The photos are logged with a timestamp. This will be part of your medical file." "Do you want to press charges with the MPs?" Reed's answer was immediate. "I need to file a formal report. It's a matter of procedure." An hour later, she was in the military police station, a small functional building smelling of strong coffee and floor polish. She sat opposite a staff sergeant who listened patiently, his pen scratching across a standardized form. She recounted the events without embellishment or emotion. She provided the names, ranks, and the sequence of events. She mentioned Vance's and Thorne's roles as instigators. "And you're certain you didn't provoke him, ma'am?" The sergeant asked a standard, if slightly accusatory, question. Reed's reply was simple. "I was reading a book. My presence was the provocation." She signed the report, took her copy, and left. The entire process was clinical, a sequence of documented facts. There was no anger, no thirst for revenge. There was only the quiet, methodical execution of protocol. But something was happening behind the scenes, something she wasn't telling them. Not yet. What no one in that bar realized was that Major Reed wasn't just any officer passing through. She wasn't there by accident. She was part of something larger, something carefully orchestrated. A test, an evaluation, but of what? And for whom? The answers would come later in ways that would shake the entire base to its foundation. Reed returned to her temporary quarters, a small, sparse room that looked like every other temporary quarters on every other base. She set her manual on the desk, opened her laptop, and began typing. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the same precision she'd used to dismantle Captain Miller. She was documenting everything. The conversation, the escalation, the physical contact. But she was also doing something else, something that would prove crucial in the days to come. She was collecting data, not just her own observations, but digital footprints, timestamps, cellular data logs. Passive signals intelligence that her devices had been quietly gathering the moment she entered that bar. She had learned long ago that truth wasn't just about what you saw, it was about what you could prove, and proof required evidence, documented, time-stamped, unassailable. The next morning the base was buzzing. Word had spread about the incident at the landing strip, but the story had changed, twisted. Lieutenant Colonel Vance and his men had gotten ahead of it. Their version was different. According to them, Major Reed had been drinking. She'd become aggressive. She'd made inappropriate advances toward Captain Miller, and when he'd politely declined, she'd attacked him. It was a classic move. Accuse the victim, flip the narrative, and it was working. The rumor mill churned. Officers whispered in hallways. Some believed it, some didn't, but doubt had been planted, and doubt was enough. Reed heard the whispers. She saw the sideways glances, but she didn't respond. She didn't defend herself in the mess hall or the ready room. She simply went about her duties, calm, methodical, waiting. There was a hearing scheduled, a formal inquiry. That was where it would matter. That was where the truth would speak. But until then, she carried the weight of false accusations with the same quiet dignity she carried everything else. It wasn't easy. There were moments late at night when the isolation pressed in, when the injustice of it felt like a physical weight on her chest. But she had learned, through years of being underestimated, dismissed, and doubted, that emotion was a luxury she couldn't always afford. Not yet. Not until the work was done. Days passed. The hearing approached. Vance and his men grew bolder. They walked the base with confidence, secure in their numbers, their rank, their version of events. They had each other's backs. They had coordinated their stories. And they had something else. They had the institutional bias that assumed a lone female officer was probably lying, probably emotional, probably unstable. They thought they had won before the hearing even began. They had no idea what was coming. How do you fight a lie when the lie has momentum, when it has allies, when it has the weight of assumption behind it? Reed knew the answer. You don't fight it with words. You don't fight it with emotion. You fight it with facts. Cold, irrefutable, undeniable, and that's exactly what she intended to do. The hearing room was small, sterile, designed for function over comfort. A long table at the front. The presiding officer, a stone-faced full colonel. The accused officers, Vance, Miller, and Thorne, sat together on one side, their lawyer beside them. Reed sat alone on the other side. No lawyer, no advocate, just her and a thin folder of documents. The room smelled of old coffee and tension. Vance testified first. He spoke with confidence, his voice steady, his story rehearsed. He painted a picture of a lonely, desperate female officer who had too much to drink and made advances toward a subordinate. When rejected, she'd lashed out. It was unfortunate, tragic even, but it was her fault, not theirs. Captain Miller went next. He described the assault he'd supposedly endured, how she'd attacked him without provocation. His face was serious, wounded. He played the victim well. First Lieutenant Thorne corroborated their story. 3 officers, 3 witnesses, 1 narrative. It should have been enough. Then it was Reed's turn. She stood, walked to the front of the room, and placed her thin folder on the table. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't appeal to emotion. She simply began presenting evidence. First, the medical report. Time-stamped photographs of the bruise on her cheekbone, the result of Miller's punch, not her own aggression. The doctor's notes documenting her calm demeanor, her factual recounting of events. Then, the military police report. Her statement filed immediately, detailed and consistent. But that was just the beginning. Reed opened her laptop and connected it to the room's projection system. The screen behind her flickered to life. "I'd like to present additional evidence," she said, her voice calm, methodical. "Surveillance footage from the landing strip security cameras." The room went silent. Vance's face drained of color. The video played. High definition, time-stamped, it showed everything. Reed sitting alone in the booth, Vance and his men approaching, the escalation, Miller throwing the water, the punch, and then in brutal clarity Reed's defense. The joint lock, the sweep, Miller crashing to the floor. The video was silent, but it spoke louder than any testimony. It showed, without room for interpretation, exactly what had happened. But Reed wasn't done. "I'd also like to submit this," she said, pulling up another file. Audio recordings from my personal device which I keep running for situational awareness in unfamiliar environments. The hearing officer leaned forward. You recorded the entire encounter? Yes, sir. It's standard practice for me when operating in uncontrolled spaces. The audio captured every word, every threat, every lie. She played the recording. Vance's voice clear as day mocking her, Miller's escalation, the sound of the glass being thrown, the threat, the punch, and then after the incident something else. The three officers huddled near the bar, their voices low but not low enough. We need to get our story straight, Vance's voice said. Just say she came on to you and got angry when you said no. They always believe that. We'll bury her. The room was frozen. The presiding officer stared at the screen, his jaw tight. Reed continued, her voice steady. And finally, sir, we have the cellular data logs from the officers' phones, which I passively collected at the scene. They show a flurry of text messages beginning exactly 90 seconds after the assault. The messages, time-stamped and authenticated, show Lieutenant Colonel Vance instructing his subordinates to get their story straight and outlining the very same false narrative they presented to this hearing. She pointed to a specific message on the screen. It was from Vance to Miller. The text read, "Just say she came on to you and got angry when you said no. They always believe that. We'll bury her." It was over. The proof was absolute. The chain of custody unbreakable. Vance stared at the screen, his career, his honor, his freedom dissolving in front of his eyes. He had brought a fist to a data fight, and he had been systematically dismantled. The presiding officer looked from the screen to the three accused men. His expression was one of pure, unadulterated contempt. "This hearing is concluded," he said, his voice like cracking ice. "The charges against Major Reed are dismissed with prejudice. Lieutenant Colonel Vance, Captain Miller, First Lieutenant Thorne, you are hereby remanded for court-martial on charges of assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and perjury." The guards stepped forward. The three men who had walked in like kings were led out in disgrace. Reed watched them go, her expression unchanged. She had not gloated, she had not even smiled, she had simply presented the facts. The system, once corrected with the proper data, had worked as designed. She closed her laptop, gathered her folder, and left the room. The hallway outside was empty, silent. She walked alone, as she often did, back toward her quarters. But inside there was something she rarely allowed herself to feel: relief. Not triumph, not vindication, just the quiet relief of knowing that the truth had been heard, that she had been believed, that the system for once had worked the way it was supposed to. But there was something else she didn't know yet, something bigger than the hearing, bigger than the assault, something that would change everything. What happens when the truth comes out but the story isn't over? When justice is served but the mission was never about justice at all? Reed was about to find out. Because what happened in that bar, what happened in that hearing, was all part of something larger. A test she'd passed without even knowing she was being tested. And the results were about to be revealed. A week later, the entire base was assembled for a mandatory formation on the main parade ground. The sky was crisp, clear. The kind of blue that made everything feel sharper, more real. The mood was tense. The story of what had happened in the bar and the exercise and the hearing had spread like wildfire through the base. Everyone knew. Everyone had an opinion. Colonel Evans stood at the podium, his voice amplified across the field. He didn't mince words. He detailed the assault on Major Reed. The false accusations made against her. The conclusive evidence that had exonerated her. He announced the results of the court-martial. Vance was reduced in rank to captain and would be processed for dishonorable discharge. Miller and Thorne were reduced to second lieutenants and would serve their remaining time in non-command administrative roles at a remote Arctic base. Their careers were over. "This command failed Major Reed," Evans stated, his voice ringing with authority. "We allowed rank and reputation to cloud our judgment, and we almost punished the victim instead of the perpetrators. That failure in procedure and culture stops today. Let this be a lesson. Competence and character are our currency, not swagger and connections. The truth, backed by proof, will always prevail." He paused. The entire formation waited. There was something else. You could feel it in the air. Evans turned to the side of the stage. "But that is not the only reason we are here today." A black staff car, flags flying from its fenders, pulled up silently. The door opened. Out stepped a four-star general, the commander of United States Strategic Command himself. The entire formation snapped to attention. The general walked to the podium, taking the microphone from Evans. "At ease," the general said, his voice calm but radiating immense authority. "I'm here to correct the record on Major Evelyn Reed." The words hung in the air. Correct the record. What did that mean? She was not here on a simple temporary duty assignment. Major Reed is part of a specialized talent management program designed to identify and elevate uniquely skilled officers who operate outside the conventional career path. Her performance during the Cerberus Sentinel exercise was not a surprise to us. It was a confirmation. The crowd stirred. Murmurs rippled through the ranks. The general continued. "She didn't just stop a simulated attack. She rewrote the book on cognitive electronic warfare." He turned and faced Reed, who stood at attention before him. "Her file is unlike any I have ever seen. Expert ratings in signals intelligence, deep-sea salvage operations, extreme-range marksmanship, and close-quarters threat neutralization. She is, in short, the kind of officer we need to fight and win the wars of the next century." The general then did something that sent a shockwave through the crowd. He reached forward and, with a deft movement, removed the gold oak leaf insignia from Reed's shoulders. From his pocket, he produced two shining silver stars. "By order of the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense," the general announced, his voice booming across the parade ground, "Major Evelyn Reed is hereby promoted to the rank of Brigadier General, effective immediately." He pinned the stars onto her shoulders. A stunned silence hung over the formation. No one moved, no one breathed. Then it was broken by a single sharp command from Colonel Evans. "Attention!" The general stepped back. "Brigadier General Reed, your new command is Project Chimera, our premier advanced warfare directorate. Welcome to the general staff." He extended his hand. She shook it firmly. Her face was composed, but inside something shifted. This was real. This was happening. Then another ritual began. The general nodded toward the disgraced officers who were being held nearby to witness the ceremony. He singled out the man now known as Captain Vance. "Captain Vance," the general commanded, his voice cold, "you will be the first to render the proper courtesy." Vance, his face a mask of humiliation, was marched forward by the guards. He stopped 3 paces from Reed. His entire body trembled with a mixture of rage and shame. He looked at the star on her shoulder. The star that represented a future he would never have, a level of success he could not comprehend. Slowly, painfully, he raised his hand in a salute. It was the salute of a broken man, offered upward to the woman he had tried to break. Reed returned the salute with a crisp, perfect motion. Her eyes were steady, holding his for a beat longer than necessary. In that moment there was no pity, no triumph. There was only the quiet finality of a chapter closing. The ceremony concluded. The formation was dismissed. As the crowd dispersed, an old master chief named Torres made his way through the throng. He stood before her, not at attention but with the quiet respect of an old teacher. He held out a small, worn object. It was one of her old patches from the Dive Academy, a simple insignia. "Figured you might want this back, General," he rumbled. "You always earned it." She took the patch. A silent exchange of respect that meant more than all the pomp and circumstance. It was an acknowledgement of the foundation upon which her success was built. Later that day, Brigadier General Evelyn Reed stood in her new office. It was large, impersonal, mostly empty. The single silver star on her collar felt no heavier than the gold oak leaf had. Rank to her was not a prize, it was a tool. A new level of access and responsibility. Major Calloway entered, placing a final thin folder on her polished desk. "All the paperwork from the court-martial is filed and closed, General," he said. "Thank you, Major. Your work was exemplary." "I just followed the evidence you provided," he replied with a small smile. "It's easy to find the truth when someone bothers to document it." He saluted and departed, leaving her alone with the quiet hum of the building. She walked to the window, looking out not at the parade ground of the past but at the airfield. A sleek, unmarked transport jet was being prepped, its engines shimmering in the late afternoon heat. Her next mission was already loading. On her desk, she arranged the few items she had brought with her: her laptop, the technical manual that had started it all, and the old diver's patch from Master Chief Tours. She placed it next to a small framed insignia of a phoenix rising from ashes. The light from the window caught the Latin inscription at its base: Fides in tenebris, faith in darkness. The room was quieter now. The culture of the base had been shifted, recalibrated. She picked up a secure data pad, its screen glowing with the initial briefing for Project Chimera. The mission was already beginning. There's a moment in every story where you realize the ending was the beginning all along, where the quiet strength you mistook for weakness was actually preparation, where the person you underestimated was simply waiting for the right time to act. Major Reed, now Brigadier General Reed, had never sought validation from those who doubted her. She had never needed their approval. She had only needed to do the work, to document the truth, to trust the process. And when the moment came, she didn't need to shout. She didn't need to prove herself through bravado or spectacle. She simply let the facts speak. Sometimes dignity doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't argue. It doesn't beg to be seen. It works in silence, builds in shadow, and waits for the moment when the truth can no longer be ignored. Evelyn Reed understood something that her accusers never did. That real power isn't loud. It's not about who speaks the loudest or who throws the first punch. Real power is quiet, methodical, and rooted in competence. It's about being so prepared, so thorough, so undeniably excellent that when the moment of reckoning comes, there's nothing left to debate. The evidence speaks, the truth stands, and the noise fades away. She had been underestimated her entire career. Too quiet, too technical, too focused on the details while others focused on the spectacle. But she had learned long ago that spectacle fades, details endure. And when you're standing in front of a panel defending your honor, defending your truth, it's the details that save you. Not your charisma, not your connections, the facts. Cold, documented, irrefutable. In the bar that night, she could have responded with anger. She could have escalated. She could have shouted back, pushed back, made a scene. But she didn't, because she knew something they didn't, that every action has a consequence, every word leaves a trace, and the person who controls the narrative is the person who controls the data. When Captain Miller threw that punch, he thought he was teaching her a lesson about respect. What he didn't realize was that she had already won. The cameras were recording, her device was capturing audio, her systems were logging cellular traffic. She wasn't just defending herself in that moment. She was collecting evidence for the battle she knew would come later because she understood the game better than they did. It wasn't about who was stronger. It was about who was smarter, who was more prepared, who had the proof. And when the hearing came, when Vance and Miller and Thorne presented their carefully coordinated lie, she didn't fight them with emotion. She fought them with their own words, their own messages, their own arrogance captured in timestamps and audio files and cellular logs. She dismantled them not with force but with precision. And when it was over, there was nothing left to argue about. The truth had spoken, and it had spoken louder than any voice in that room. But the promotion, that wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about vindication. It was about something she'd been working toward her entire career, something she'd never spoken about, never advertised. She had been part of a program, a test, an evaluation of officers who operated differently, who thought differently, who built their careers not on charisma or connections but on competence, on results, on the quiet, relentless pursuit of excellence. The assault in the bar, as terrible as it was, had become part of her evaluation. How would she handle it? Would she crumble? Would she lash out? Would she compromise her principles? She had done none of those things. She had documented. She had followed protocol. She had trusted the system to work once given the proper data. And in doing so, she had proven something far more valuable than her ability to defend herself. She had proven her ability to lead. The four-star general who pinned those stars on her shoulders hadn't come to reward her for surviving an assault. He had come to recognize what she'd been all along, an officer of exceptional capability, Someone who could operate in the shadows, in the details, in the quiet spaces where wars are won or lost before the first shot is ever fired. Someone who understood that the future of warfare wasn't just about bullets and bombs. It was about data, signals, information. The ability to see the battlefield not as it appeared, but as it actually was. And that required a different kind of warrior, one who carried a laptop as readily as a rifle, one who understood algorithms as well as tactics, one who knew that the most powerful weapon in the modern world wasn't a gun. It was the truth, properly documented and impossible to deny. Captain Vance had walked into that bar thinking he owned the room. He had rank. He had allies. He had the confidence of a man who had never been truly challenged. What he didn't have was the wisdom to recognize that the quiet woman in the corner booth was more dangerous than he could possibly imagine. Not because she could fight, though she could, but because she could think. She could plan. She could see 10 steps ahead while he was still focused on the first. And when he tried to bury her with lies, she buried him with facts. There's a lesson in that, a hard one. The loudest voice in the room is rarely the most powerful. The person who demands respect is rarely the one who deserves it. And the officer who measures success in swagger and spectacle is rarely the one who achieves lasting excellence. Brigadier General Evelyn Reed stood at her window, looking out at the airfield, at the jet being prepped for her next mission, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not pride exactly, not relief. Something quieter, something deeper, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The base behind her had changed. The culture had shifted. The officers who had once dismissed her now saluted her. The system that had almost failed her had been corrected, but she knew the truth. The system hadn't saved her. She had saved herself, with preparation, with discipline, with the quiet, relentless refusal to be anything other than exactly who she was: competent, thorough, unshakable. She picked up the data pad, Project Chimera, her new command. The details were classified, but the mission was clear: to build the future of warfare, to lead the officers who would fight battles not with brute force but with intelligence, with strategy, with the kind of quiet excellence that doesn't announce itself but proves itself through results. She had spent her entire career preparing for this moment. Every class, every exercise, every night spent reading technical manuals while others were drinking at the bar. It had all led here, to this office, to this command, to this star on her shoulder, and she was ready. There's a phrase carved into the insignia on her desk: Fides in tenebris, faith in darkness. It's an old motto from a unit she'd served with years ago. A reminder that not every mission happens in the light, that not every victory is public, that sometimes the most important work is done in shadow by people who never seek recognition, people who do the job because the job needs to be done, people who trust that the truth, properly documented and patiently defended, will eventually prevail. Major Reed had become Brigadier General Reed not because she was loud, not because she was aggressive, not because she demanded attention, but because she was excellent, consistently, quietly, undeniably. And in the end, excellence always rises, not always quickly, not always fairly, but always, eventually, inevitably. The jet's engines roared to life outside her window. Her next mission was waiting. There would be no parade, no ceremony, no public acknowledgement, just the work. The quiet, necessary, world-changing work that happens when someone cares more about results than recognition. She closed her data pad, picked up her gear, and walked toward the door. The star on her shoulder caught the light one last time, a reminder of what she'd earned, but more importantly, a reminder of what she still had to do. Because rank to Evelyn Reed was never the destination. It was just another tool, another level of access, another opportunity to serve, and she intended to use it well. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.